Mid-Texas Lutheran University.
Welcome to the continuation of this year's Krost Symposium, the Neurocognition of Music and Art. Before we get started, I just want to remind students that there's a separate card swipe for each session, so be sure to get that done at the beginning or the end of each session if you need credit for that. I hope you had the opportunity to explore the gallery a little bit. It's a great thing that Kyle Olson put together, including maybe even rating your own aesthetic experience to each work of art. I think if you haven't done that, I hope you do get a chance to kind of check out that, because the gallery is actually directly related to research conducted by our next presenter, Dr. Ed Wessel, from the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, Germany. Dr. Wessel holds a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, and a bachelor's in cognitive science from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Throughout the past several years, he's also worked as a research scientist at the Center for Brain Imaging at New York University and as co-director of the NYU Art Lab. His main areas of research include neuronal basis of aesthetic experience, visual preferences, neurobiology of information search, and brain imaging methods. The gallery you walk through to get to Wupperman Little Theater is directly inspired by the 2012 research article, "The Brain on Art: Intense Aesthetic Experience Activates the Default Brain Network," that Dr. Wessel co-authored with Drs. Gabrielle Starr and Nava Rubin, colleagues at New York University. I'm particularly excited that he's able to be here with us today. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Ed Wessel.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Good. Well, I'm extremely excited to be here. I feel very honored to be here. I really want to thank Mike Zuckery and Steve Anderson for their help, and I especially want to mention that this is the first time I've ever seen a research project of mine rendered in gallery form, and it's a special treat for me. Today I'm going to tell you a bit about a few research projects that I've been working on over the past few years, trying to understand what happens in the brain when people are moved by artwork. And I will be focusing primarily on visual experiences, though I'm interested in how the brain basis of visual aesthetic experiences relate to aesthetic experiences in other domains as well, such as dance or poetry or music. And I'm happy to talk about some of that during our panel, if you'd like. So by way of introduction, I think I don't need to tell you that humans seek, that humans seek out aesthetic experiences. We visit art museums, we go to concerts, we check out sculpture, we listen to music, we attend performances, and we also, evaluate a variety of things in an aesthetic manner. So for example, we evaluate scenes and faces and even mathematical equations in a way which sometimes gives us that wow feeling that we've had a transformative aesthetic experience. And people spend a lot of money on these types of experiences, so there must be something important about them. Not that money and not that the bottom line always defines what's important, but it's clear that as a society we value these types of experiences. I'm interested in understanding the psychological and neural mechanisms that support these types of experiences. And I'd like to start first with a definition. So what exactly is an aesthetic experience? So I'm going to give you a few definitions from some philosophers that have thought about this quite a bit. So Burke in the 1700s talked about the beautiful and the sublime, and he thought about aesthetic experiences in terms of taste. And he was coming from a perspective that some people in society had taste and other people don't. We don't necessarily think about things quite in that way anymore. I think that the 18th and 19th centuries saw a revolution where philosophers started to realize that the common people could have aesthetic experiences as well, and art actually even started changing in its nature and focusing on themes that anyone could understand and enjoy rather than just the nobility. Kant, he has written some excellent work on aesthetic experience, a lot of work that really influences current theories of what happens in the brain. And he really focused on this idea that the determining basis of what we find to be beautiful or aesthetically moving cannot be anything other than it's a subjective experience. He also hypothesized that beauty is an emotion that is devoid of interest. What he means by that is that we can find something beautiful and like it, but we don't necessarily want to possess it. And I think this is an important point. It's one that people are currently trying to understand. And also, it's important here that when we say that we find something to be beautiful or we find a piece of music to be moving, we say, wow, that's an amazing piece of music. We don't necessarily need to couch it in the, I think that this is beautiful, because the experience is so overwhelming that even though we know our neighbor may not like the same thing as us, the experience itself is universal, and we assume that other people have these moving experiences as well. And this is a definition that I really like. Santayana said that beauty is a pleasure that we attribute to an object. That is, an internal subjective state that we attribute to an external object in the world. And this dichotomy between subjective internal states and things out there in the world that influence us strongly is a dichotomy that I'm going to return to several times today. Lastly, I would mention a few caveats, which is that I'm interested in moving beyond beauty as the paradigmatic emotion of aesthetic experience. There are many types of artwork which you might not call beautiful, but that are strongly moving. My favorite example is Guernica by Picasso, which is a giant painting done after the Spanish Civil War. And it is by no means a beautiful painting. It is a disturbing, dark painting. But that painting, when I saw it in person, blew me away. And it is most definitely an experience that I would repeat and that I would recommend everyone else have. So it is definitely a piece of moving artwork, even though it is very challenging and not necessarily beauty. And we would like to understand some of these aesthetic experiences that don't fall into just the merely pretty. In addition, we can have aesthetic experiences evoked by non-art objects, such as faces, scenes, objects, or conversations, and we're interested in understanding these commonalities. What is it about aesthetic experiences with artifacts of human culture, like architecture or art, that is shared in common with our experiences with a beautiful face or experience with a beautiful sunset? Is there something fundamentally in common between these experiences? Okay. And I'd like to also give you a bit of motivation for why a neuroscientist cares about studying aesthetic experience. First of all, aesthetic considerations affect decision-making. The purchases that you make when you go to the store, or the decisions you make to buy a particular house with some view on top of a hill, or the relationships that you have with people are influenced by aesthetic judgments. Second, I think that aesthetic experiences are related to learning. So when you have that aha experience, when you have a conversation with someone and are blown away by some statement that they make, that sense of wow, I've learned something new, I think is intimately related to aesthetic experiences, and that some of what's going on for us when we are strongly moved by something involve these types of insight, these aha experiences. And in fact, I've been exploring a theory that humans get pleasure from consuming information, and that this acts as a fundamental drive for us to learn about the world around us. That is, when you sit here and hopefully hear something new from me today, you get pleasure from it, and that actually makes you want to seek out more. Again, I also think that aesthetic considerations are important because they affect well-being. They affect our quality of life. Office productivity, hospital recovery time have been shown to be improved when the environment is an aesthetic environment, when there's a view of nature out a window, or when an office is designed in such a way that there is a naturalistic-like setting where you have the ability to see through the space and there's natural light and natural movement of air. Anhedonia, a core symptom of several mental disorders, is clearly closely related to aesthetic considerations. Anhedonia means a state in which you don't get pleasure from the things you normally would. So for example, someone who used to love going to hear music, but they're so depressed that right now they just couldn't even be bothered, or they won't engage with eating their favorite foods. They say that food tastes bland, these types of things. In addition, recently I've done some work with NASA, and they're interested in understanding how isolated, confined, and extreme environments, like you might find in a space capsule hurtling towards Mars, how people in these environments deal with the fact that they don't get the sensory stimulation that most of us do every day when we just walk around campus. So how can a lack of these types of aesthetic experiences affect people's psychological well-being when they're not available to them? And meaningful work is an idea that the work that we do can give us meaning. It can give us meaning because we get pleasure from understanding. And so therefore, taking what we learn from aesthetic experiences and trying to weave that into the structure of jobs, the structure of tasks, such that we are self-motivated to keep working, I think is also an idea that we'd like to explore more in the future. And these are all very practical considerations. These are the kinds of things that grant agencies care about. But what do you care about? I think that aesthetic appreciation is important just because. It's important just because it's a fundamental way of interacting with the world, right? And because, as a fundamental way of interacting with the world, it's important that we try to understand it. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this heuristic that understanding or recognizing something, in fact, I think that aesthetic modes of interacting with the world represent a heuristic for understanding the world. And this, I think, is what gives rise to this kind of adage that beauty is truth, that there's some link between having an aesthetic experience and understanding something deeply. Okay, so the psychology and neuroscience of aesthetics seeks to answer a few questions. One question I care about is what are the cognitive or mental processes and representations that support aesthetic experiences? And how can a psychological and neural understanding of aesthetics support well-being or improve learning? And I'm not so interested in understanding whether or not we can use brain imaging to figure out what is beautiful. I'm not using the scanner to play critic, right? I'm also not using the scanner to figure out whether or not something classifies as art or not, okay? These are potentially interesting questions, but they're a little bit problematic, and they really don't get at the heart of the cognitive and mental questions that the field is really trying to understand. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you about 3 different lines of research I'm conducted in my lab and walk you through some of the data to give you a sense for how we make scientific inferences about such a subjective topic. So I'm going to be showing you a number of images of brains and some images of behavioral data, and I'll walk you through those so that hopefully you can understand what their implications. Okay, first I'm going to tell you about the central role of meaning and the role that meaning plays in aesthetic experiences. Second, I'm going to walk you through the project that Mike and his assistants so kindly rendered for you outside here on the neuroscience of aesthetics, the brain basis of aesthetic experience. And third, I'm going to tell you about a line of new research I've been working on over the past few years that tries to understand whether or not aesthetic processes are the same across different domains of aesthetic inquiry. And I'll give you more information on what I mean by that later. Okay, so first of all, we are interested in understanding whether or not the aesthetic experiences that people have, so when you find a particular painting or a particular scene to be beautiful or moving, we want to know to what degree do external objective stimulus features play a role. For example, things like symmetry or aspect ratio, the golden ratio, which has been celebrated since antiquity. Contrast or specific colors. Does everyone prefer green, or does everyone prefer, does red always lead to low preferences? Are things that have higher fractal dimension, higher complexity, are they preferred? So these are some of these stimulus dimensions we might explore. On the other hand, there's also all of these internal subjective factors that play a role in what you might like. So people tend to like things that are new and novel. People also have meanings associated with the things that they see. We have strong emotional responses. And clearly, we also care about things that have personal relevance to us, things that kind of reach out and touch us and talk to us about something that we've experienced in our own life. So the problem is, if we want to try to understand the relative weight that these play in generating aesthetic experiences, the problem is that for many types of experiences, stimulus attributes and subjective attributes tend not to be separable. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. And the research in this area has largely relied on average preferences across a large number of people, with no attention paid to the degree to which different observers express similar preferences across the stimulus set. So much of the data has taken a group of people like you and collected your preferences and then averaged across all of you and said, okay, well, on average, we see that this type of artwork is preferred over this type of artwork, or this type of image is preferred over this type of image, but that really doesn't allow us to get to the nitty-gritty of understanding what's really driving things at an individual subject level. And here's the example that I think will be illustrative. So most of you, I would imagine, probably prefer this image to this image, but there's a lot of differences here, right? First of all, there are a lot of visual differences. This image here has greens and it has a more fine detail. There are fewer, this image has more straight lines, it has more gray. So there are these low-level stimulus differences. In addition, there's clearly semantic differences as well. I'm sure many of you have quite pleasant associations with gardens, and you imagine this could be a nice place to be and a nice place to sit and look at the flowers for a while. Whereas you may not want to hang around in this particular spot so much. It might remind you of work. It might remind you that you have somewhere to be or that you're late for some appointment. And so these are the levels of analysis that we're going to contrast here. To what degree are the differences here really driven by these visual differences versus these higher level semantic differences between these two images? And the method that I'm going to use is to ask whether or not people like the same thing. So we're not going to look at average preferences across a group of people. We're going to look at the agreement between people. When do different people like the same thing, and when do they express individual preferences? And this technique really offers us insights into the information that informs aesthetic appreciation. So in a study I did with Nava Rubin in 2010, we showed a set of subjects a set of real-world images like these, a set of gardens and parking lots and fields and mountains. And then we showed them also a set of abstract images, fractals and kaleidoscopic images, and these pseudo-colored kind of object-like things that if you were to look at this, you would have a very hard time actually turning and describing it to the person sitting next to you because there's no semantic information in there. There's no nameable objects. There's no way for you to kind of really just write this down in a sentence. There's clearly a lot of content here. There's differences in color. There's differences in shape. But there are no semantic differences here. And so this is the data that we see, and I'm going to walk you through this plot because I'm going to be showing you several plots like this. So first of all, on the x-axis here, on this axis, what I'm showing you is a measure of agreement across people. And then what these two distributions show is where different pairs of people lie. So if everyone liked exactly the same images, all the data would be clumped up here near 1. If everyone liked something completely different, then the data would all be clumped around 0. Okay? So now let's look at these two different distributions. First, if you look at this dark one here, which is for the real-world scenes, you can see that on average there's quite a high degree of agreement across people. When people look at real-world scenes, they tend to agree. They don't agree perfectly, but there's a strong degree of shared preference across different people. If I know that one person likes this image, I can predict with pretty high accuracy that the next person is also going to like that image. Now, if I take the exact same group of people and I show them these abstract images, we see that the whole distribution shifts far to the left here. And in fact, I don't need statistics to tell you that this distribution is different from this distribution, but in fact, they're highly significantly different. What this means is that the same group of people, when I show you abstract images, now show very individual preferences. So if one person likes this image, another person may hate it. So what this tells us, and this just reiterates what I've walked you through here, this highlights the importance of meaning for preferences. So when there is semantic information, meaning present, that information has a greater influence on people's preferences than the low-level visual stuff. And in fact, another group came to a similar conclusion even just by asking people their color preferences. They found that the best predictor of people's preferences for certain colors is not something about the color itself, but is actually the associations that people have with the objects that they can think of that are those colors. So for example, people tend to like greens and blues because they like sky and grass, and they tend to not like mustardy yellows because it reminds them of human excrement and things like that. So this type of a model is actually the best predictor, even for something as low level as color. So the tagline from this, what we take away from this is that shared semantics lead to shared preferences. And I think that this has large implications in many different areas. So anytime you look at a group of people, if those group of people have a more similar experience, a more similar life experience, they're going to have more similar aesthetic preferences. And if you could take two groups of people or two people and actually help them have more shared experience, then their preferences might become more similar to each other. Okay, and I'd also like to briefly tell you a bit about how we think this develops. So we took a set of 5-month-old infants. We measured using an eye tracking device, a device that measures what images the infants are looking at. We showed them a subset of these same images that we showed in adults. And we measure which image they look at longer. And we do the same thing. We show them real-world scenes and abstract images. And first of all, we replicate the finding with adults, so we get much higher agreement for the real-world scenes than we do for the abstract images. So these two bars are very different. But now when we look at the infants, we see that both bars are high, and there's no difference. So what this means is that infants actually show agreement with each other on all of these different images. And the way that we interpret this is that the preferences of 5-month-old infants actually are largely driven by lower level visual features. So if you think about the tools that an infant has to analyze its visual world, they are limited. An infant can see and understand the shapes that you're looking at and something about the lines and the colors, and those low-level tools inform their preferences. But as you get older and you develop an entire repertoire of abilities for analyzing your visual world, these new tools, just as Dan mentioned yesterday, happens in a language, these new tools that you develop guide your preferences. So much like what we know for language and what we heard about for music yesterday, people's preferences are really determined by the skill set, the set of tools that they have to analyze their visual world. So again, like learning a language, when you develop more expertise in that visual language of understanding your world, then those new tools, that expertise guides your preferences. Okay, so now I'd like to switch and start telling you about a brain imaging project. And the guiding question that we had in this project was to understand whether or not there's a unique brain state that is associated with aesthetic experience. In general, the field that I work in, neuroaesthetics, we define ourselves as a field that is aimed at understanding the neural and behavioral basis of the perception, appreciation, and production of art, as well as the pleasurable perception of faces, natural objects, and scenes. My particular work is mostly focused on appreciation and perception. I've only just done a little bit of work on the production of art, and I'm not going to be telling you much about that today. Okay, now the tools that we use, a primary tool that I use is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. How many of you have had an MRI before? Okay, so quite a few of you. So you might be quite familiar with this scary-looking tube, right? I take a subject and I put them on this gurney here, and then slide them into this big scary tube and make lots of loud banging noises that scare the subject. And somehow this allows us to see the brain, right? So the way that this, basically what we do is we collect this data and it gives us these pretty brain images that we then interpret. So the technique that I use is similar to conventional MRI, the type of MRI that tells you if you have a problem with your knee or if you have something going on in the structure of your brain. But we use a specific technique that allows us to measure blood flow. And the blood flow in the brain, it turns out, is actually correlated with local neural activity. So we can use it as a signature for what parts of the brain have been active, and we can, through clever experimental design, create images of what parts of the brain are involved in specific tasks. Okay, and I'm going to give you here, I'm assuming most of you are not brain imaging experts, so I'm going to give you Brain Imaging 101 in a minute. All right, are you ready? Okay, so the first type of data that we collect is called this bold fMRI data, so that's what I just told you. It's actually a measure of blood flow. And what we do is we take a snapshot of the brain activity about every 2 seconds, and it's quite low resolution. So you can imagine if you were to look in one part of the brain and I had you doing a task and then not doing a task, for example, you had to look at some images for 10 seconds and then look at a blank screen for 10 seconds, and then look at some images for 10 seconds and then look at a blank screen for 10 seconds. In a part of the brain, I might see a time course like this, something that goes up and down and up and down, okay? So we do some statistical modeling of that. And then the second type of data we collect is anatomy data. So we take a high-resolution anatomy of the structure of your brain. And from this, we can do some cool computational things where we take the brain structure and we model the surface of the gray matter. So the brain is composed of these nuclei deep in the brain, and then there's a covering on top of it that we call the cortex. And each hemisphere of the cortex, if you were to take it out and stretch it out, is about the size of a medium pizza. So we can actually do this computationally, where we take the cortical structure of the brain, we then computationally inflate it like a balloon, and I'll show you some images of what that looks like. There's actually one right here. So we can inflate this brain like a balloon, and then we can also unfold it into a flat surface, and we can look at activation in the brain on this unfolded flat surface. So this gives us a way to really understand the neighborhood relationships in the cortex rather than simply viewing the results in 3 dimensions, in 3D, which is sometimes hard to interpret. So then we can take these 2 types of data, the structural data and the task functional data, and we can combine it to do different things. We can compute statistical effects, or we can display the task data on top of either a 3D image or a inflated surface image. And maybe just quickly, so these are 2 types of brain scans that I may show you more images of. So this here is an image that's taken halfway through the brain like this, as if you're looking from the side. And so this is where the eyeball would be, and this is where the back of the head would be. And so we can see what's going on here on this middle surface of the brain. This is actually the same middle surface, but it's been inflated like a balloon using this inflation technique that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so to get back to this question that we care about, I want to just also make one caveat, which is that the work that I've been working on is trying to understand specific moments. A moving aesthetic experience. So when you look at a particular piece of art and you find a piece of art to be moving. Now, this is different from another question that is equally valid that you might ask, which is what goes on in the brain when people are in an aesthetic mode of processing. So when you go to an art museum or when you go to a concert hall, you're in a different mode of interacting with the world than you are if you are looking for your keys, or if you are having a conversation with someone, or if you are at work. And so the work I'm going to tell you about today really focuses on this question, the question of what's happening in these particular moments when someone finds something to be very moving. Okay, so there has been some previous work on this, and here I'm going to show you an example of it. So here's one group, Semir Zeki in London, that has done a number of experiments trying to understand what happens in the brain when people rate things as being beautiful. And he's found that when you show people visual art and when you have people listen to music, that in both cases you get activation in a region here in this part of the brain. So again, the eyeball would be right here, this would be the front of the brain, and this is the back of the brain. And this region right here is called the medial prefrontal cortex and is definitely a focus of interest. However, there's work in other areas of neuroscience that posit this brain area does other stuff. So for example, when you go to the supermarket and you're looking at pasta sauces and you want to decide if you should get the Prego or the Ragu, you're making a value judgment, and that value judgment of which thing do I like more also seems to involve some of the same area. So how do we know that what's going on here is really due to aesthetics at all and not just due to the value that people are assigning to particular objects, right? On the other hand, we also know that many of these same regions are involved in various aspects of social cognition. So for example, when you are having a conversation with another person, you assume that that other person has a mind. This is called theory of mind, and this is a process that we use to understand what it is that other people are saying. And some of these same processes of theory of mind also seem to involve some of these same parts of the brain. So the question, to return to that question, it's important to understand, is there actually something that's unique about aesthetic experience? Or is aesthetic experience just an assemblage of other kind of neural functions that we already know something about from other fields? Okay? So the way that I'm going to approach this is that I'm going to show people a variety of artworks. Many of these artworks you have now had a chance to look at yourself and consider whether or not you found them to be aesthetically moving. And we tried to construct this experiment in a way which really respected individual differences. So first of all, we span a range of stimuli with a large and diverse stimulus set, such that hopefully there's something for everyone. And that these might span a wide range of reactions, that some of them are beautiful, some of them evoke awe, some of them may just be confusing, some of them may even really raise negative emotions like fear or sadness, but some people might find those types of emotions aesthetically moving. Our instructions really stress the subjective nature of the response, and we scan during a first exposure. The task is a recommendation on a 4-point scale, so you tell me which images you think might be deserving of being included in an art collection. And in general, the subjects see each image for about 6 seconds when they're in the magnet. So first, if we look at people's behavioral responses, Here's another one of these plots where what I'm plotting is the agreement across people. And what I want to draw your attention to is that this distribution sits just barely above this 0 line. So what this tells us is that people have incredibly individual responses when it comes to art. What you like is not predictive at all of what the person sitting next to you likes in this type of an experiment. And this has an interesting consequence. So you can imagine that one image here, this cloud image, is really liked by some subjects, but other subjects give it the lowest rating. And this image here is really liked by this subject, but then the first subject gives it a really low rating. So methodologically, it means that when we look at the brain imaging activity, we know that the brain imaging comparisons are driven by individual appreciation and not by stimulus factors. So for example, it's not that some activation in the brain is driven by faces or just driven by color or something like that. Okay, so here's some brain data, and it looks complicated, but I'm going to try to break it down for you. So these are, again, these inflated images of the brain, and the eyeball would be here. This is looking at the brain from the side. And here, this is the same brain, but now tilted, so you're looking at the underside of the brain, okay? And this is a slice through it. And what I really want to draw your attention to here is that there are these activations here in the back of the brain. These are regions that respond more for the images that a person rated as being strongly moving than to images that were rated as being not at all interesting or not at all moving. And what we see is that these brain regions show this linear response. So when I show you an image you rate as a 1, this brain region responds. When I show you an image you rate as a 2, it responds a bit more. When I show you an image you rate as a 3, it responds a bit more. And when I show you an image you give a 4, it responds even more. So there's this kind of linear response in these brain regions. And we see that in a few other brain regions as well. Including one region that shows a decrease, but it's also a linear decrease. On the other hand, these parts of the brain, in the front part of the brain, the anterior part of the brain, closer to the eyeballs, your forehead, show a very different pattern. So they no longer show this linear pattern. They show what I call a step-like pattern here, where these brain regions aren't really engaged much by artworks that you rate a 1, 2, or 3. They're really only strongly engaged by artworks that you rate a 4. So what we're seeing here is evidence for two separate processes. We're seeing evidence for one process which responds on every single trial and is giving a graded response, and I think is really a sensory-driven perceptual pleasure. And then we're seeing evidence for a second system which only comes online when you're strongly moved. So it's not just a strong pleasure, but really being aesthetically moved is a whole different beast. When you have those moments, you're like, wow, that really blew me away. It's not just that you're dialing up your pleasure to 10. There's really a whole other process kind of coming into play. Okay? So it's clear that there's something that can happen where to make a particular event cross this threshold to become more than a quickly fading stimulus-driven pleasure. And in order to investigate this, I'm going to show you the data in a slightly different way. So here what I'm plotting is the image of the brain activation when a person is looking at an image they rated as a 1, the lowest rating, and I'm comparing it to the activation when they're not looking at anything. They're looking at a blank screen, okay? And we see what we expect here, which is that we get some activations in visual parts of the brain. But what I want to draw your attention to here is the blue stuff. What this means is that there are parts of the brain that are actually more active when you're staring at a blank screen than when you're staring at a piece of artwork. So what does that mean? What does that mean for these parts of the brain to actually be suppressed when you look at a piece of artwork? Well, this set of brain regions has been studied extensively now and is referred to as the default mode network. You'll see that there's a lot of similarity here between this pattern of these green patches and my pattern of blue patches. This default mode network is now understood to be a highly interconnected network of brain regions that support self-referential, internally focused mental processing. So when you're not engaged with the world, but when you're kind of thinking inwardly, when you're thinking about what did I have for breakfast, or what am I going to do tomorrow, or you're kind of trying to internally focus mentally, or when you're just mind wandering, this brain network is quite active. And it is typically suppressed when you show someone an image, when you have them engage in a task. And that's what we see here. We see that this brain network is suppressed, so that's not surprising. Now, if I show you the same image here for images that you rate a 2, we again see that these blue regions are still there. And the blue regions are still there for images that you rate as a 3. But now, for images that you rate as a 4, we see that these blue regions are largely diminished and, in fact, completely gone in this medial prefrontal region. So what does this mean? And this is just an extraction of the data from here. What this means is that this brain network that is normally suppressed when you engage with the external world seems to be re-engaged when you find something aesthetically moving. Okay? I'm going to walk you through that in a second in a bit more detail. So what we see is that there's these networks in the brain that are oriented towards the external world, and there's a network in the brain that is oriented inwardly. And typically, these operate in a seesaw pattern, where either you are paying attention to the external world or you're paying attention internally. But in these moments, rare moments, when you find something to be aesthetically moving, we see that both brain networks are active. And most likely, what we think this means is that this is actually a mechanism by which the external world, these sensory processes, can actually influence and interact with the internally directed, self-referential part of your brain. So we think that this is likely a rare state, and it may be a potential hallmark of aesthetic processing, that being aesthetically moved really involves this simultaneous looking outward and looking inward. And so this engagement of internally focused mentation may be a key characteristic that distinguishes aesthetic appreciation from other pleasures. Okay, so I know that was a lot. That was a lot of brain data. Hopefully you understood some of it. And now I'm going to walk you through another project that's in progress. And I'm going to do it relatively quickly so as to leave you some time for some questions. And I may skip some portions for time. And so what I'm going to tell you about here is a project that tries to understand what happens when you make judgments about different domains of aesthetic objects. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that when you look at a landscape, there are features of that landscape that may drive your preference for that landscape, right? When you look at a face, a beautiful face, there are features of that face that may drive your attractiveness for that face. Or when you look at an artwork, there are features of that artwork that may drive your aesthetic experience for that artwork. However, the features that are actually driving your perception in these three cases are very different. The features that are present in a landscape are not present in a face, and vice versa. So our perception relies on different features, and we think that the aesthetic appreciation, therefore, also relies on different features. And so we're interested in understanding to what degree aesthetic appreciation, the mechanism in your brain for giving you pleasure and helping you recognize beauty in the world, whether or not this mechanism is a domain general system, meaning that there's one system that can handle all of these different types of things, or do you have to have specific processes that are tailor-made for faces and for landscapes and for music and for all of these different types of aesthetic experiences that you might have. So it's really a question about the nature of the mechanism. Okay. So the stimuli that I'm going to use include faces, natural landscapes, architecture, and visual artwork. And here are some examples of the stimuli that we use. And the task that people do is, again, they see an image and they make a rating on a 7-point scale using a mouse. And what we first of all see behaviorally is, again, we measure when do people like the same things? Do people agree in which images they find to be pleasing? So when we look at faces, we find that there's a very strong degree of agreement. If one person finds a particular face to be beautiful, it's extremely likely that everyone else is also going to find that same face to be beautiful. So there's a large amount of shared preference for faces. On the other hand, I already told you that there's actually very little shared preference for artwork. So your preference for artwork doesn't really predict someone else's preference for artwork very well. So what about these other categories? Well, when we look at landscapes, we find that landscapes are not as high as faces, but they're quite similar. There's also quite a strong degree of shared preference. On the other hand, architecture is actually more similar to artwork. It's much lower here, so people's preferences for artwork are much more individual. So what we see here in general is that there's variability in agreement across category. Now, there's a subtle issue here, which is that this experiment was done in different groups of people. So each of these bars represents a different group of people that did this experiment. So we did a follow-up test where we used the same set of subjects, and they evaluated just 2 of these categories. And in that study, we find, again, that there is a significantly higher degree of agreement for landscapes than for architecture. So what are the implications of this behavioral result? First of all, so categories of stimuli that are more behaviorally relevant from an evolutionary perspective, like faces and landscapes, come to rely on more similar information across people. On the other hand, aesthetic appreciation for architecture and artwork, which I'm referring to as artifacts of human culture, rely on more individual aesthetic sensibilities. So we're seeing this distinction between things that you might experience in the world that we have a strong evolutionary history with as a species, that really, when different people look at these objects, they're using more similar information to guide their preferences. Yet when you look at things that humans have created, things that for which we don't really have a specific behavioral outcome for interacting with them, these things seem to rely on very individual aesthetic sensibilities. And actually, before I move on, this gives us, I think, a potential working definition of what an aesthetic mode is, which is that an aesthetic mode of interacting with the world is one in which function or fitness is not necessarily the primary concern. So you're not necessarily concerned whether or not a particular image or a particular painting or a particular object is performing a function. You're really just looking at these other kind of emotional aspects to it. This is a working definition. This may change. Okay, so then turning to the brain, we want to know, is there a domain general representation of aesthetic appreciation that can handle all of these categories? And in general, one reason this is an interesting question is that we know that in the back of the brain, so this is a view on the underside of the brain, and down here is the back, and up here is the front where the eyes would be sitting right here. We know that the perception of faces, objects, and scenes are largely segregated into different chunks of tissue. So then the question is, when I move up here to the front part of the brain and I ask about aesthetic appreciation, do we also see separation? Okay, and I think I'm going to skip this. All right, so there has been some previous work on this that looked at faces and landscapes and did find some commonalities in the parts of the brain that was mediating people's aesthetic experience. But I would like to extend this to these artifacts of human culture like architecture and artwork. So we want to know specifically whether or not the default mode network that we found important in our previous study contains a domain general representation of aesthetic appreciation. The approach we're going to take is one that's called the classification approach or multivoxel pattern analysis. We're going to use 3 categories of images. And importantly, note that 2 of these categories are photographs, but 2 of these categories are artifacts of human culture. So we can try to compare and understand whether or not the differences we're seeing in the brain are because we're looking at photographs versus non-photographs, or we're looking at artifacts of human culture versus more natural things. The task that people do is, again, how much does this image move you? And what we're trying to understand is whether or not the pattern of activity in a brain region contains information about whether or not something is moving or not. So the protocol involves showing someone an image, and then they make a response. And in one scan that takes about 5 minutes, we do 37 trials like this. So in our experiment, people come in for 2 different days, and they'll do a scan with landscapes and a scan with architecture and a scan with paintings, and then they come back another day and they do a few more scans. So there's a lot of data, right? This is a long experiment for the subject to do, and this gives us 148 trials in each domain. And first, we do an analysis similar to what I showed you before, where we look at the response for 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we see that we replicate the general pattern here that we saw before, that there's blue, 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 and then the blue goes away, right? And we see that for landscapes and architecture, there's a similar pattern as well. So landscapes, this region here is blue, 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 and then the blue largely goes away. It's similar for architecture, although a bit weaker. So this gives us some suggestion initially that there is a domain general process happening here across all these 3 types of stimuli. Then we identify this default mode network specifically in individual subjects using what is called a resting state scan. And here's an example of that. So the colored regions here, the red and yellow regions, are parts of the DMN. And then in these other colors, we've identified 6 nodes, and we're going to test these subnodes of this network. So we take all this data, and what we do is we use a machine classification technique. So all of these scans here are composed of many individual trials, right? And each of these trials can be classified as either a preferred or a non-preferred stimulus, a low preference or a high preference stimulus. Then we can take some of this data and we can use it to train a classifier, so a little machine. And the job of this machine is to take the brain data and try to determine whether or not the particular trial was a liked trial or a disliked trial, okay? And then we can take this little machine and test it on some of the other data and see how well it does, okay? And so this machine here, trained on this data, got this one right, it got this one wrong, and it got this one right. So then we can come up with a percentage score. And the idea here is that if a particular part of the brain contains information about aesthetic appeal, then a machine trained on that type of data should be able to do this distinction, right? On the other hand, if that part of the brain doesn't contain any information about aesthetic appeal, then this machine should be at chance. It shouldn't be able to extract any important information and do this classification. So this approach is called classification. It's a machine learning technique. And so what we can do is we can train on one chunk of data and test on another, and then we iterate through that. So we train on a different set of data and test on another set of data, and another set, and another set. So this is called cross-validation, and it gives us a way of averaging across multiple iterations and improving our estimates. And so here, what I'm doing is I'm training on paintings, and I'm testing on paintings. And then I can do the same where I train my classifier on paintings, and I test it on landscapes. So now I've trained a machine to recognize aesthetic appeal for paintings, and I want to know if this machine can now predict people's preferences for landscapes. Okay, so this is a very strong test for whether or not a part of the brain contains a domain general representation of aesthetic appeal. Okay? All right, so what do we find? I'm not going to walk you through these results in detail, but in general, what we see, first of all, is if we look at the within category results, so for example, can a machine be trained on art and then predict art, we find that it does better than chance. So this line here would be completely at chance. And we find that it does better than chance in this part of the brain for some of the categories, although not as well for landscapes. On the other hand, when we look across categories, so we train on art and test on architecture, or train on landscape and test on architecture, we see that this part of the brain also contains information that is domain general. So this is a relatively good signal of domain general processing in this part of the brain. And if we look at all of these parts of the brain, which I'm not going to talk you through, in general, we can see that 2 of these regions here actually do show good domain general signal. And here's another part of the brain which can do the within category, but not so good at the across category. But then there's some parts of the brain that don't have better performance than chance at all. And when we take all of these regions together, we again see that the default mode network is able to, we are able to use data from the DMN to predict people's performance in this task. So what does all this data mean? What it means here is that patterns of activation in this network contain information about aesthetic appreciation for a variety of aesthetic domains. It's strongest in some parts, and it satisfies a strong test of domain general sensitivity to aesthetic appeal. And then lastly, we kind of go searching through the brain for other parts of the brain to see whether or not there's other regions that are domain specific. And I'm not going to walk you through this either, but in general, we do find that there are parts of the brain that seem to do well at predicting people's performance on architecture, but nothing else. Or parts of the brain that predict people's performance on art, but nothing else. Interestingly, when we look at this, this medial prefrontal part of the brain, which in this weird display I'm showing you right here is in this part of the brain right here, we don't see much in the way of landscape preference. So it seems as if there's no part of the brain right here that seems to specifically deal with landscapes and nothing else. And my wild conjecture, and this is very much work in progress, is that possibly part of the system that drives our aesthetic appeal is actually built based on our experience with landscape. And that therefore the domain general system that we then use for other categories actually is the same as the system that we use for landscape. So landscape perhaps is really driving the creation of a system in the brain that gives us aesthetic appeal. And then when we have to make judgments of artwork and of architecture, we have to recruit other resources in order to generate aesthetic appreciation for those categories. Okay, and now I just want to give you a big picture overview of all of this data I've shown you. So first of all, I've told you that measuring agreement is a valuable method. Second, I've told you about the importance of meaning in aesthetic experience. Third, I've told you about the default mode network and that it's coactive with sensory networks during moving aesthetic experiences, and that we have evidence for a domain general aesthetic process. And lastly, there seems to be something important about the difference between faces and landscapes versus artifacts of human culture. And at a more general level, hopefully I've convinced you that the tools of cognitive neuroscience and psychology can be used to probe the nature of aesthetic experience. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and acknowledge some of my collaborators, in particular Gabrielle Starr and Nava Rubin, who have worked with me on quite a number of these studies, a number of my students at NYU, Amy Belfi, a postdoc working with me at New York University, and Ilkay Izik, who is a graduate student working with me at the Max Planck Institute. Thank you.
We're going to have a panel up here in just a minute. It'll start at, what time are we? 10:30. Questions?
I'm interested in your work on architecture,
Sure.
and in particular, what comparing architecture with art versus, say, comparing with face. Presumably, when you look at face, there's some biological thing there, a reproduction or safety, and architecture falls more in the line of human artifacts.
Sure.
I was involved in a library project several years ago where it wasn't the architect, but someone who was more of a aesthetic person involved in the architecture was trying to convince us that a particular architectural style for the library would be generally preferred.
Okay.
Because it presented a safety perspective. So
Yeah.
you're withdrawn, but you have a perspective on the outside, and for generations of
Yes.
that safety perspective, that type of architecture would be preferred by most people.
So that you raise a couple good points. So what your architecture friend was referring to is what is known in the field as prospect and refuge theory. And the idea here is that in landscape, that this developed throughout evolution, this idea that we have biases to prefer areas and places, and perhaps in architecture as well, that provide us an ability to see oncoming threats but feel safe ourselves. And I think that the evidence for that is mixed, but I think it's quite possible that could play a role. In my data, I generally see that people have very different preferences for architecture, that there's not a huge amount of common preference. But it's possible that what degree of common preference there is might be partially mediated by concerns like that. I also think that architecture is something that if you are an architect, or if you have a lot of exposure and understanding of architecture, then you might be more sensitive to these types of differences. But most of us, we don't really think about the fact that certain types of buildings are not structurally safe, right? Certain types of designs. I could design myself, I don't know anything about architecture from a design perspective. I could make a building that looks really pretty, but that an architect would look at and say, that would fall down in 10 minutes. And so most naive people don't really have a sense of those constraints. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we see such large individual differences across people.
One quick follow-up on that. Every college campus has a group of buildings that we all now consider to be extraordinarily ugly. And they were built in the late 60s and 70s, you know what I'm talking about?
Sure.
And now all of us look at that and say, what were they thinking at that time? Because those are, almost everyone agrees. What accounts for such a shift in shared preferences in such a brief?
Yeah.
You wouldn't look at faces 30 years ago and say, that was a beautiful person.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
now it's not.
I mean, the same does happen in art, where the questions and techniques and particular kind of wow moments in artwork change from generation to generation. So when we look back at artwork from the 18th and 17th and earlier centuries, a lot of it was about the Madonna and Child, and most of us can go to a museum and we can only look at so many Madonna and Childs before we're like, okay, I get it, Whereas for them, there were other symbols and messages in those paintings because that was the current style at the time, and it was the kind of the formal structure within which they were working. So they might, for example, use different colors to paint the robes of the Virgin Mary, and that indicated something about, it held deeper meaning about their views on that or on the church. And then the way that they might paint the face of the child was sometimes actually a reference to the benefactor who had paid for the painting or things like this. So those kinds of details are lost on us, and I think that the same types of cultural movements can happen. And at the time, my guess is that these ideas of form and relating form to function were so paramount that they kind of led to these plazas that are on this huge architectural scale that really aren't human scale at all. And now we've learned a little bit more about what is it that actually makes a specific location pleasing and enjoyable for a person to walk through. So I think a lot of people recognize that there were these kinds of mistakes that were top-down influences on based upon not really aesthetic considerations, but these high theoretical ideas of what was a good piece of architecture. Let's see, yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
For more information, please visit tlu.edu.